You know, sometimes the greatest armor you can wear is the version of yourself no one expects. My name is Helen Bradford, and for 3 years after I buried my husband, I wore that armor. A life that looked fragile from the outside. Not because I wanted to fool anyone, but because I had to protect myself. I wasn't hiding a secret that hurt anyone else. I was just trying to stay invisible, building a shield out of quiet routines, old sweaters, and the kind of silence that keeps people from asking many questions. Most saw a woman barely holding herself together. They never realized every thread of that disguise was woven on purpose. And then, out of nowhere, a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday pulled me back into the world I'd been avoiding. My son Eric's voice sounded like it was walking on eggshells, forced casual, every word a little too stiff. He invited me to dinner. Vanessa was making her so-called famous lasagna. I almost laughed. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, could burn water. But I bit my tongue and played along, like I always did. When Eric told me to dress a little nicer this time, because Vanessa likes things to look presentable, I just stared at myself in the mirror, gray hair pulled back, no makeup, an old cardigan. I was the image of a grieving widow living modestly, pinching pennies, skipping meals if necessary, or so they thought. What they never knew was that my every move was intentional. The small apartment was paid off, the war, now clothes were a costume, and my quietness was calculated. That Friday, I walked 6 blocks in the biting October air, even though I could have driven, my real car safely hidden across town. The walk was just another piece of the story. Their house looked exactly the same as it had 7 years ago. The house I bought for them as a secret wedding gift, the deed tucked away in my name under a trust they never knew about. Eric opened the door with a polite hug, his eyes dodging mine. The house was warm, filled with the scent of candles and designer rugs, but it all felt staged, cold, like a showroom. Vanessa appeared perfectly put together, giving me a look-over from shoes to hair. She talked about her lasagna like she was a celebrity chef. My place setting at the table was mismatched and faded, the message clear as day. I didn't belong. They didn't have to say it out loud. I listened as Eric talked about work, and Vanessa about her latest yoga routine. I said almost nothing, but I noticed everything. The way they looked at each other, the subtle performance of hospitality, the little ways they kept me at arm's length. Then, halfway through dinner, the atmosphere changed. Vanessa put on her most concerned face and began the speech I'd been waiting for. They were worried about me, about my tiny apartment, about how unsustainable my life looked from their perspective. Vanessa suggested I get a job, a simple one, like greeting people at Walmart. Her tone was so patronizing it almost made me laugh. Here was a woman who'd never kept a job for more than a month telling me I needed purpose, after I'd spent decades building a business with my late husband from scratch. It was never about helping me, it was about making me smaller, making sure I stayed in my place. She insisted that I needed independence, self-respect, as if a blue vest and a name tag could give me that. She said it wasn't healthy for me to rely on others, even though I'd never asked them for a single thing since Alan died. To Vanessa, I was just a problem to solve, an obstacle to move out of the way. I looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Is that what you think I am, a burden?" She glanced at Eric for support, but he stayed silent. That cut deeper than all her words combined. I thanked them for dinner, and as I left, I turned to Vanessa and told her she might want to update her own resume. She tried to read my face, confused and a little worried. I didn't explain. I didn't slam the door. I just left because I knew the storm was already on its way, and they had no idea who it was coming for. 3 days later, Eric called. I could hear the confusion in his voice. This time, he wasn't just speaking for Vanessa. He finally agreed to visit my apartment, something he'd always avoided before. As he looked around at my modest space, he tried to call it depressing. I just smiled and poured him good coffee, the kind I save for special occasions. He got right to the point. Vanessa was upset, thought I'd threatened her. But Eric's real question was about me. What was I hiding? Was something going on? I handed him a folder, thick with financial documents, deeds, investment accounts, proof of a life he never imagined I had. He looked stunned as he realized everything he believed about me was a lie, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I needed to know who loved me for me, not for what I could give. I asked him, when was the last time Vanessa treated me with real kindness, invited me to something without obligation, defended me? He couldn't answer, and for the first time he seemed to see her clearly. It was time for the truth, not just for me, but for both of us. That Friday, I walked into their my house, dressed not as the poor widow, but as the woman I'd always been. The house I had secretly owned for years. Vanessa was waiting, tense and defensive, demanding answers. Why pretend to be poor? Why lie? I told her, because I needed to see clearly, to know who would stand by me with nothing to offer but myself. Then I revealed everything: her calls to elder law attorneys, her plans to get legal control over me, the deed to the house in my name. She tried to argue, claiming tenant rights, but I reminded her she was a guest and her welcome was over. Vanessa stormed off, Eric stunned by the truth. He finally told her to leave, and for the first time he chose me, his real family, over the illusion Vanessa had built. She packed up and left, furious and defeated. The silence she left behind was the first peace that house had known in years. Eric needed time to heal. He moved out for a while, needing space to understand everything he'd just learned, not just about Vanessa, but about himself, about me, about the lies we tell ourselves when we don't want to see the truth. When he came back, he was different, humbled, grateful, and ready to reconnect. He told me about someone new, a woman named Rachel, who valued the simple things, who didn't care about money or appearances. I could see the hope in his eyes. Maybe now he'd finally learned what real love looks like. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like the one I'd lived in disguise. I stood on the terrace of my penthouse, glass of wine in hand, the city spread out before me. The house that once belonged to Eric and Vanessa was sold. I gave Eric the proceeds, no strings, no tests, just a real gift, a chance at a fresh start. Vanessa. She ended up serving time in county jail, barred from contacting either of us. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I wasn't pretending to be fragile. I was Helen Bradford's survivor, businesswoman, mother. Eric and I rebuilt our bond. I met Rachel, and I liked her instantly, genuine, kind, unconcerned with wealth or status. Eric was finally ready to lead with who he really was, not with what he owned. As for me, I stepped into the light, no longer hiding behind grief or strategy. I traveled, donated, finally lived without fear. And every time I passed a mirror, I saw the woman I'd protected all along, strong, unbreakable, and free. If you've ever felt small or invisible in your own family, dismissed or ignored for choosing quiet over spectacle, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do in my place? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know. And if this story spoke to you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear that they're not a burden. They're the foundation. That night, as the city hummed quietly below my penthouse balcony, I let myself remember the woman I used to be. I thought about those long, lonely evenings after Alan died, when silence echoed through empty rooms, and I wondered if anyone would ever truly see me again. Those were the nights I decided to play the long game, to let the world believe I was smaller, weaker, more vulnerable than I actually was. I knew that the world, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, your own family, will show you who they really are when they think you have nothing left. Now I watched the city lights and realized how much had changed since Vanessa's departure. Word traveled fast through our old circle of friends. Some offered shallow sympathy, as if losing a conniving daughter-in-law was some great tragedy. But the people who mattered most, the ones who'd quietly stuck by me all along, reached out with genuine warmth. Invitations to dinner, walks in the park, unexpected cards slipped under my door. All small reminders that kindness was still alive. I welcomed those connections, grateful for every honest friendship that had survived the years of my self-imposed exile. Eric began to visit more often. The first few weeks were awkward, as if we were both unsure how to exist outside the roles we'd been stuck in for so long. But over time, the weight between us lifted. One chilly afternoon, he brought Rachel to the penthouse for brunch. She arrived with fresh flowers and a wide, easy smile that reached her eyes. Over coffee and pastries, she talked about her students and her love for old bookstores. She never once asked about money, never hinted at inheritance or privilege. Instead, she asked about Alan, what he was like, what made our marriage last so long. When I told her stories, Eric watched quietly, a gentle gratitude in his eyes. For the first time in years, I felt like family wasn't something I had to pretend to belong to. It was something we were building again, from scratch, but this time on truth. Not everything was easy. Vanessa's absence left a strange silence in Eric's life, a hollow space where trust had once been. There were nights he'd call just to talk, his voice tight, unsure. Sometimes he'd admit that he missed the version of Vanessa he thought he knew. Grief isn't always for the good things you lose. Sometimes it's for the illusions that die with them. We talked late into those nights about the cost of letting people use you, about the difference between kindness and weakness. I told him the lessons Alan and I had learned building our business, how we'd trusted the wrong people more than once, and how surviving betrayal doesn't make you harder, it makes you clearer. He listened, and little by little, I saw him begin to forgive himself. Meanwhile, I started to reclaim my own life. I reconnected with causes. I cared about women's shelters, youth entrepreneurship programs, organizations that helped widows rebuild their futures. I attended charity galas, not as someone looking for approval, but as someone who finally belonged in her own skin. At one event, I was approached by a young woman who recognized me from my business days. She told me that my company had once given her mother a job when no one else would, and that one act had changed the course of their family's life. Her words stuck with me. I realized that no matter how much others tried to diminish me, the truth of who I am, the woman I'd always been, could never really be erased. And then, one evening, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from Vanessa, written in a shaky hand from the county jail. The envelope was thin, the handwriting unfamiliar, desperate. In it, she apologized not for what she'd tried to take from me, but for what she'd lost in herself along the way. She wrote about her own childhood, her insecurities, how she'd convinced herself that money and status would finally make her feel safe. She begged for another chance, or at least some forgiveness. I sat with her letter for a long time. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I felt a kind of sad understanding, the way you feel when you realize someone else's cruelty was only ever a mask for their own fear. I didn't reply, not right away. Sometimes the most powerful response is the life you build after the storm. As the months slipped by, Rachel became more and more a part of our lives. She and Eric moved into a small apartment together, close enough for Sunday dinners and movie nights. She brought lightness with her, a fresh start, laughter that filled rooms, a sense of hope that money could never buy. Watching Eric find happiness again was the true reward, more satisfying than any quiet revenge. But there was one last thread to tie. The house, the one I'd bought for Eric and Vanessa, the home that had been the stage for so much of our heartbreak, it was time to let it go. On the day it sold, I stood outside for a moment, hand on the front gate. I remembered the day I'd bought it, how proud I'd been, how sure I was that giving my family security would bring us closer. Now I knew better. Security comes not from property or bank accounts, but from honesty, resilience, and love, the things you can't forge or fake. I used some of the proceeds from the sale to create a scholarship fund in Alan's name for women starting over after loss. I donated the rest quietly, no press releases or plaques, just small ripples of change sent out into the world. And when I finally walked away from that house, I felt no regret. The armor I'd worn for so long had served its purpose, but it wasn't needed anymore. I was free, not just from Vanessa or the lies we'd lived, but from the burden of pretending to be anything less than who I really am. I hope you're still with me, listening, because if there's anything my story proves, it's this. Your power lies in your silence, your strategy, your truth. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself they want. You only owe yourself the freedom to live as you are, seen, strong, and unafraid. As summer melted into autumn, the city outside my window shifted gold and crimson leaves spinning through crisp air, the kind of season that always made me restless. With Vanessa gone and the last shadows of that old life clearing away, a quiet new chapter began. For the first time in years, I found myself breathing easy, my days no longer weighed down by old secrets or pretending to be smaller than I was. But healing, I discovered, isn't a single moment. It's a series of choices you make, every single day. One morning, I woke early, sunlight crawling across my bedroom ceiling, and realized I didn't have to answer to anyone anymore. I could travel, pursue projects I'd put aside, even rediscover parts of myself I'd hidden away. So I booked a ticket, one way, no itinerary, to Florence, a city I'd always dreamed of visiting, but never allowed myself to explore. I wandered winding streets, took language classes with strangers, and filled my sketchbook with the colors and textures of a life I thought I'd lost. Meanwhile, back home, Eric was learning what it meant to rebuild after betrayal. I called him every week from wherever I landed: Florence, then Vienna, then the green wilds of the Scottish Highlands. Sometimes we'd talk for an hour, sometimes just a few minutes, but our conversations changed. They weren't about money or appearances or obligation. He'd tell me about Rachel's class, about the two of them fixing up their tiny kitchen together, about hiking trips gone hilariously wrong. I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy hope, and a gentle kind of pride. One Sunday, while watching a rainstorm blur the city outside my rented flat in Prague, I received a video call from Eric and Rachel. They'd just adopted a rescue dog, a scrawny brown mutt with ears too big for his head. Rachel laughed as the puppy chewed on her sleeve, and Eric grinned at the chaos. For a moment, all the years of loss and heartache felt so far away, replaced by something simple and pure. A family, found again in unexpected ways. But life, I learned, never really lets you close old chapters for good. One evening, after returning home, I opened my mailbox and found another letter from Vanessa. This one was different. No desperate apologies, no anger. She was out on probation, trying to put her life back together. She wrote that she'd started working at a small bakery, getting up at dawn, hands dusted with flour, learning to make ends meet without anyone's help. She told me she'd enrolled in counseling, that she was truly trying to become someone better. For a long moment, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to erase her from my story forever, to pretend none of it had happened. But another part, the part that had always believed in second chances, the part Alan loved most, couldn't let go of the hope that people really could change if given the chance. So I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote back. I didn't offer forgiveness, not yet, but I did offer honesty. I told her what she'd taken from me wasn't money or property. It was trust, and that's not something you can rebuild with words alone. I wished her well, I meant it, As the months rolled on, I focused on the present. I took cooking classes, hosted small dinners for friends, started volunteering as a mentor to young women in business. Every time I spoke to a group of them, some fierce, some scared, all searching for their place, I saw pieces of myself in their questions, their ambition, their doubt. I told them the truth. Sometimes your greatest strength is the story no one sees. Sometimes you have to let the world underestimate you, so you can learn who's really standing in your corner when the mask comes off. Eric and Rachel invited me to their wedding in the spring, a small ceremony in a city park, wildflowers everywhere. Rachel wore a simple dress, and Eric looked at her with a kind of awe that melted every scar that story had left in me. When it was time for toasts, Eric lifted his glass and thanked me, not for money, not for rescue, but for showing him that strength is quiet, and real love never asks you to become less. After the wedding, I took another trip, this time to the coast. I spent long afternoons walking the shoreline, watching the tide erase footprints in the sand. I realized that was what I'd been doing all along, not erasing the past, but letting the waves of honesty and forgiveness smooth out its sharpest edges. If you've stayed with me through this journey, you know by now revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as reclaiming your own happiness. Sometimes it's in letting go, moving forward, and refusing to let anyone else define your worth. So if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, wondering if it's safer to shrink than to stand tall, remember this: your story is yours to tell. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't what you take back, but what you finally let go. There's a strange freedom that comes when you realize your life is finally, truly your own. I felt it in every moment that followed waking up in sunlit rooms, not worried about who might judge me, who might misunderstand the quiet strength I'd always held back. My days fell into a gentle rhythm: morning walks through city parks, afternoon coffee with friends old and new, evenings spent curled up with a book or scribbling thoughts into a journal I'd never let anyone else read. A year after Eric's wedding, the scholarship fund I started in Alan's name began to take on a life of its own. The first round of recipients sent me handwritten notes, each one sharing how a small act of generosity had changed their path. A single mother going back to college, a middle-aged woman rebuilding after a divorce, a young immigrant opening her first small business. Each letter reminded me why I'd chosen silence and strategy for so long. Not to hide, but to observe, to protect what mattered until I was sure it could flourish in the open. Eric and Rachel flourished too. Their little apartment grew warmer with every visit. The puppy became a fixture, always underfoot and always adored. Sometimes I'd babysit the dog while they took a weekend trip. Those quiet evenings, just me and that loyal mutt, felt like a kind of healing no therapy could buy. One afternoon, Eric called, his voice alive with excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, Rachel's pregnant." I almost dropped the phone. For a moment, grief and joy washed over me together. Alan would have loved to see this day, to welcome a new grandchild. But I knew he was with me in spirit, the lessons he'd taught me woven into every decision I'd made, every word I'd shared with Eric. Preparing for the arrival of a grandchild gave all of us a sense of purpose. Rachel and I bonded over nursery ideas and late-night talks about motherhood, the real kind with its fears and fierce love, its exhaustion and joy. When their daughter arrived on a soft spring morning, I held her in my arms and realized just how much life could surprise you, even after so many losses. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, and I whispered a promise: "You will always know you are loved for who you are, never for what you can give." Vanessa never replied to my letter. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved out of state, taken a job at a small bakery, and kept mostly to herself. Sometimes I wondered if she'd found peace, or if she still searched for validation in the approval of strangers. I let her story fade quietly into the background, a lesson I carried but didn't need to revisit. Time passed. The penthouse filled with laughter and the clatter of little feet. I traveled often, but I always came home because for the first time in a long time, home was a place of comfort, not a shield. I became Grandma Helen at the playground, swapping stories with other women who'd survived their own storms. I cheered for my granddaughter's first steps and Eric's promotions at work, each milestone a quiet testament to the resilience of our family. One day, years after it all began, I stood before a crowd at a women's conference, invited to speak about second chances and the power of silent strength. I told them the truth, that the world may try to convince you that your value comes from your utility, your wealth, your role as someone else's support. But real power, I said, lives in the courage to walk away from what diminishes you and to believe in your own story, even if you have to live it alone for a while. When the applause faded, I looked around the room, so many faces, some scarred by loss, some still searching for hope. And I realized the real revenge wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about reclaiming the fullness of my life and showing others how to do the same. If you've followed me to this point, tell me in the comments, what would you do with your second chance? How would you use it to build a life that's truly your own? I'd love to hear. And if you want to see what happens as this legacy unfolds, you know what to say. After the whirlwind of new beginnings, my life settled into a peace that was both unfamiliar and precious. I found myself embracing routines I'd once considered mundane, watering the flowers on my terrace, lingering over Sunday breakfasts with Eric, Rachel, and my granddaughter, savoring the small, quiet joys that used to slip by unnoticed when my days were ruled by pretense and caution. Sometimes I'd be invited to speak at local business luncheons or women's groups. Each time I stood before those rooms, once so intimidating, and told my story with the kind of honesty I'd spent years hiding. People would approach me afterward, some in tears, some in awe, some quietly relieved to hear a voice that said, "You can survive anything, and you can start over at any age." But the greatest change came from within. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to shrink myself or dull my strengths to fit someone else's idea of who I should be. I wore the clothes I wanted, traveled on a whim, and never again apologized for taking up space. And when people tried to define me by my past, the widow, the burden, the afterthought, I simply smiled, knowing they only saw the surface. The truth was deeper, stronger, and finally free. Eric and I shared a new kind of closeness. We talked openly about Alan, about our mistakes, our hopes, even our regrets. He told me one night over dinner, "I wish I'd seen through things sooner. I wish I'd listened more and assumed less." I squeezed his hand and told him the same thing I'd learned the hard way. We see what we're ready to see. Forgiving yourself is the only way forward. Rachel joined in, her warmth a steady presence in our lives, her laughter filling any cracks that remained in our family's foundation. My granddaughter grew quickly. One day she was toddling after the puppy. The next she was showing me her crayon masterpieces, declaring, "Grandma, I want to be brave like you." That simple sentence felt like a ribbon tying together all the years I'd survived, all the quiet choices I'd made to protect my heart and my truth. In her, I saw a future where no one would have to hide their strength to feel safe. Every so often, I'd revisit the letters from scholarship recipients or reread the first, cautious message I'd sent to Vanessa, tucked away in a drawer with other memories. I didn't hold on to bitterness. I let the past be just that, a teacher, not a chain. I traveled to new places, learned to cook new dishes, picked up painting again. Each blank canvas was a reminder that you can start over whenever you choose, no matter who or what you've lost along the way. And as I watched the sunset from my terrace, I realized the truest revenge was never about justice or payback. It was about reclaiming my happiness, loving my family better than I ever had before, and finally, joyfully, refusing to hide. If you're still listening, maybe this is what you needed to hear today. You are not defined by what others expect from you. Your silence, your strategy, your scars, they all make you who you are, but they don't have to keep you small. You can choose the light, you can choose the truth, and you can write your next chapter with all the courage in your heart. In the years that followed, my world became richer in ways I never could have imagined when I was surviving behind those second-hand cardigans and silent, measured smiles. Freedom has a flavor you can't describe until you've tasted it. The simple joy of deciding who enters your life and who no longer has power over you. My days filled with little adventures, volunteering at the library, mentoring young women in business, even enrolling in a painting class where I learned to see the world through new colors. My story, once defined by betrayal and survival, was now being rewritten as one of renewal. Every family gathering at Eric and Rachel's cozy home felt different now, warmer, closer, unburdened by the sharp edge of suspicion. The laughter was genuine, not forced. I'd sit with my granddaughter on my knee, teaching her how to draw spirals or telling her the kind of bedtime stories my mother once told me. She'd ask, "Grandma, will you always be here?" And I'd smile, promising her that as long as she needed me, I'd be standing strong right by her side. Eric grew into the kind of father I'd always hoped he'd be. Gentle, patient, never afraid to show his heart. Sometimes, late at night, he'd call just to talk, sharing worries about work or asking advice about raising his daughter. Our conversations were honest, stripped of the old distance, and we both cherished how far we'd come. Rachel, with her grounded kindness, became not just my daughter-in-law, but my friend. She'd bring over fresh bread, swap recipes, or drop by with the baby when Eric worked late, her laughter as steady as the tide. I became a quiet force in our community. When the women I mentored struggled, I shared my story, not as a warning, but as a beacon. I told them that sometimes the people you trust most will be the ones who disappoint you, but you are never powerless. You can always reclaim your narrative, rewrite your ending, and build something stronger from the ashes. Their gratitude was humbling. Their courage inspired me in return. Even the scholarship in Alan's name began to grow year after year. More women took bold steps into new lives, and each graduation, each small victory, felt like a message from the universe. You did not endure for nothing. Your pain has become someone else's hope. Sometimes, as I tidied my apartment or watched the city lights flicker from my terrace, I'd think of Vanessa. She remained a shadow in the background of my story, a reminder of how ambition, without empathy, can devour even the most promising lives. I never heard from her again, and I learned to let that be enough. I wished her well from afar, knowing that my peace didn't depend on her regret. My own happiness stopped feeling like a rebellion. It became a new normal, a life lived fully, openly, without apology. The armor was gone, but I was stronger than I'd ever been. If you're hearing this and wondering if you could ever break free from the limits others have set for you, hear me now. You are allowed to outgrow their vision. You are allowed to rebuild. And you're allowed to celebrate every quiet, powerful step forward, no matter how long it took to get here. With each passing season, I became more certain that the quietest victories are sometimes the sweetest. My days were no longer defined by endurance, but by intention. I joined a community gardening group and found a kind of joy in coaxing stubborn tulips to bloom. I took up photography, learning to capture the sunlight as it poured through stained glass windows or danced across my granddaughter's hair. Sometimes I'd catch my own reflection in a storefront window, shoulders back, eyes steady, smile unguarded, and realize how far I'd come from the woman who used to flinch at her own shadow. Eric and Rachel's home filled with new milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, scraped knees, and piano recitals. I became the family historian, scrapbooking photos and writing little notes so that, one day, My granddaughter would know the truth of where she came from, how her family had bent but not broken, how love and truth won out over greed and silence. One summer evening, after a picnic in the park, Eric turned to me as Rachel and their daughter packed up the last of the sandwiches. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you regret any of it? The silence? The tests?" His voice wasn't accusing, just searching, the way children do when they finally grow into questions they never dared to ask. I looked at him, really looked, seeing the man, not just the boy I'd raised. Sometimes, I admitted, "I regret what I lost by waiting so long to tell the truth, but I never regret surviving, and I don't regret what I gained, knowing who I can trust, and loving myself enough to stop living small." He nodded, and in that simple gesture, I saw forgiveness, his and mine. That fall, I launched a workshop for women who'd lost everything: husbands, homes, families, dreams. We met every Wednesday in a sunlit room above the old library. Some came in silent and scared, clutching coffee like a lifeline. Others arrived angry, ready to fight back at the world. Each week, as I shared my story piece by piece, I watched them open up, sharing laughter, tears, and fierce hope. They became each other's lifelines, and I realized I was building something greater than revenge. I was building community. I was turning wounds into wisdom. Occasionally, my mind would drift back to Vanessa, not with bitterness, but with the detached compassion you offer a stranger whose path simply diverged from yours. I hoped she'd found her footing somewhere, far from the war she tried to start in my home. Her story was no longer my burden. Years passed. My granddaughter started school, her confidence growing each year. She'd introduce me proudly to her friends. "This is my grandma. She's really strong." The words would stick with me, a quiet medal I wore close to my heart, and I traveled more, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, sometimes with Eric and his family. I learned to love my own company, to sit in a cafe in Paris or a tea house in Kyoto, and savor the thrill of belonging wholly to myself. As I look back now, it's clear. The ultimate revenge was never about what I exposed or took away from those who hurt me. It was about reclaiming my freedom, loving without fear, and building a life so full of honesty, joy, and resilience that no amount of betrayal could ever diminish it. As years continued to unfold, the story of my life became less about survival and more about legacy. The scholarship in Alan's name sent dozens of women down new, brave paths. Sometimes they'd write to me, sharing photos of graduation caps, business launch days, or simply a fresh start in a safe home. Each letter felt like a thread woven back into the fabric of my family's history, stitching something whole out of what had once been torn. I became a fixture at my granddaughter's school concerts and art fairs, the cool grandma, who always had snacks and never missed a single milestone. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, we'd bake together in my sun-filled kitchen. She'd ask questions with that insatiable curiosity only children have. About the world, about my past, about why I always insisted on kindness even to people who weren't always kind back. One day she pressed her flower, dusted hands onto mine, and said, "Grandma, did it ever hurt to love people who didn't love you the right way?" I hugged her close and told her the truth. Yes, it hurt, but it made me stronger too. Eric and I, both changed by everything we'd endured, found a friendship that felt as rare as it was real. We'd take long walks by the river, talking about life, loss, and forgiveness. Sometimes we'd simply sit in silence together, letting old wounds breathe in the open air, until they faded into nothing but memories. Rachel thrived as a teacher, bringing home stories of hope and resilience that reminded me how many ways there are to start again. With each season, my own sense of purpose grew clearer. I became involved in city council initiatives for women's safety and economic opportunity. I led seminars on financial independence for older adults, using my own story as proof that it's never too late to claim your power. Invitations came for interviews, podcasts, even a memoir. But the only thing I truly cared about was this: that one woman, sitting alone and frightened in the quiet of her own kitchen, might hear my story and realize she's not alone, and she's not weak. Occasionally, I'd get word of Vanessa. She never remarried, but she worked hard and slowly rebuilt a quieter life for herself. I heard she volunteered at a food pantry and once sent a donation in Alan's name. I wished her peace and let her go, the bitterness gone, replaced by something like understanding. My days were filled with beauty paint on my fingers, flower in the air, laughter echoing from my granddaughter's bedroom, long, sunlit evenings reading by the open window. I grew older, but I never grew small. I became a woman who refused to be erased, whose legacy would be measured not in money or houses, but in the lives she touched, the freedom she claimed, and the truth she dared to live. So if you're watching or reading or listening somewhere out there, remember this. You don't need anyone's permission to live boldly, to forgive, to heal, or to start over. You are more resilient than you know, and more powerful than anyone has ever told you. The older I grew, the more I realized that life isn't a story with a neat ending. It's a series of chapters, each one shaped by the choices you dare to make. I leaned into that truth with a kind of gentle ferocity, choosing joy and openness over fear or regret. My granddaughter, no longer a toddler, now a fiercely curious child with a wild imagination, became my favorite companion for weekend adventures. Together we explored museums, tried new recipes, and sat on park benches inventing stories about strangers who passed by. Her laughter became the soundtrack of my days. Eric flourished in fatherhood, becoming the patient, attentive parent I'd always hoped he'd be. Rachel's steady kindness continued to mend old wounds and knit us all together. There were holidays spent around crowded tables, summer days at the lake, quiet evenings when I'd catch Eric and Rachel exchanging looks full of the sort of partnership I once shared with Alan. Each moment was a reminder of how much we'd rebuilt, not perfectly, but honestly. I spent more and more time speaking at community gatherings and women's circles, sharing the wisdom that had cost me so much to earn. I'd begin each talk not with my success, but with my failures, the loneliness, the mistakes, the years spent doubting my worth. I told the truth about betrayal and forgiveness, about how sometimes your own silence can be your sharpest weapon and your greatest shield. Afterward, women would wait in line to hug me, to whisper their own secrets, to thank me for showing them that strength doesn't always look loud or flashy. It can be as quiet as persistence, as gentle as hope. Through the years, the ripple of that one decision to stop hiding, to reclaim my power, never faded. The scholarship fund expanded, providing opportunities for women far beyond my original vision. Young women I'd never met wrote to say my story had given them the courage to leave unhealthy marriages, to demand fair pay, to build something of their own. It was humbling, and it was healing. I traveled when I wanted, lingered in foreign cities with only a backpack and a notebook. I fell in love with painting sunrises and learning new languages, never worrying about whether anyone thought I was too old to try. Sometimes Eric and Rachel and their daughter would join me on these trips, and I'd watch them marvel at the world, proud of the new roots we'd put down together. Years later, as I sat on my terrace watching the city's lights shimmer against the night sky, I felt nothing but gratitude. I had outlived every version of myself others tried to define: the timid widow, the burden, the forgotten mother-in-law, all gone, replaced by a woman who owned her scars and her story. So, if you're still here, walking with me through this ever-evolving journey, I want you to remember, you are not the roles others assign you. You are not your pain. You are the story you choose to write next. It's strange, looking back, how life circles around, how the smallest choices can echo through the years and shape the legacy you leave behind. As I sit in my favorite chair, a soft blanket over my knees, sunlight warming the room, I finally feel at peace with the woman I've become and the story I'm leaving behind. My granddaughter is nearly grown now, her laughter echoing through the halls less often as she finds her own place in the world. But every so often, she visits with questions, stories, and that spark in her eyes that tells me she inherited not just my strength, but my curiosity too. Eric and Rachel's marriage has weathered its storms. They stand side by side, partners in the truest sense, raising their daughter with more love and understanding than I ever dreamed possible in those early, lonely years after Alan's death. The scholarship in Alan's name continues, a steady current of hope for women ready to start again. I've seen lives change, dreams take root, and it fills me with quiet pride, a kind of legacy that money alone could never buy. The community I built through my workshops and volunteer work has grown beyond me, carried on by women who once listened in the back row and now stand proudly at the front, sharing their own hard-won truths. Sometimes, late at night, I still think of Vanessa. I wonder if she ever truly understood the difference between power and love, between control and connection. I hope wherever she is, she found her own peace, but I no longer carry her choices as a weight on my own shoulders. That chapter is closed, just one lesson in a life full of them. If there's one truth I want to leave behind, it's this: silence is not always surrender, and kindness is not weakness. Sometimes it's the most deliberate, strategic strength you possess. I survived the worst not by becoming hard, but by refusing to let bitterness define me. I reclaimed my home, my family, and finally myself. Now, as I watch the city lights flicker on one last time from my window, I know I have nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. My journey wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about restoration, about peeling away every mask until only the truth remained. I am not the sum of what was taken from me, nor of who tried to write my story for me. I am Helen Bradford, daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, builder of legacies. And after everything, I am whole. So, to anyone out there who ever felt invisible, or who doubted their own power, remember this: you are not a burden. You are the foundation. Your story matters, and you are strong enough to claim your own ending. Thank you for walking this path with me. This is where my story closes honest, unafraid, and finally free.